Now welcome to another lightning response video where I'm going to try to do a couple questions here today, starting with this one from GG Blaster, who asked, Hey Thor, do you think disagreement in the fandom about the nature of the Force, the light and the dark, and the Jedi and Sith might have contributed to Disney Lucasfilm's inconsistent treatment of the Jedi? I used to align with the gray force philosophy, balance is equal parts dark and light, which admittedly was more power fantasy being a good guy who can use the dark side than an actual understanding of the lore. In recent years, I've reevaluated my belief about the Force into what I understand to be George Lucas's original version of it. Balance is the triumph of light over the dark. And that paradigm shift reframed the way I saw a lot of other things in Star Wars. Anakin's dark side tendencies became much more apparent, the Jedi were less flawed than I used to perceive, and the Sith became much more evil, and yet both Sith and Jedi characters became so much more fascinating and deep despite the loss of moral ambiguity. Consequently, the Acolyte is far less engaging to me because it tries to present a more gray philosophy. That being said, I can see how someone with that philosophy might find the Acolyte more palatable, as they are likely already critical of the Jedi and slightly more apologetic of the Sith. This is just speculation, however. What do you think, Thor? Would someone who aligns with more gray force philosophy be more likely to tolerate or even enjoy a show like The Acolyte? Should canon stick to one philosophy, entertain multiple, or leave things open to personal interpretation? If it should stick to one philosophy, which philosophy should it be? And I too can only speculate here or make an educated guess based on numerous articles I have read or fan responses and just everything that I deal with when it comes to Star Wars on a pretty much daily basis. But I do think or would imagine that, yeah, if you are more into the gray philosophy, as you call it, which is the idea that Star Wars balance in Star Wars is more like this equal darkness and light, which is opposed to what Lucas himself has said. That balance is more the rejection of the dark side, not necessarily the absence, but the rejection of it. As I have discussed in numerous videos, you cannot destroy the dark side, you cannot get rid of it, it is always there, but you can reject it and you can choose to be a better person, a more selfless person, and that is what Star Wars is all about, the choice to reject evil and to care about a greater good in a sense, that your personal wants and desires need to be considered against how that will affect other people, essentially. But anyway, before I continue to ramble about that, I do think on average, people who enjoyed The Acolyte see the Force or Star Wars philosophy as more gray, or they may also just enjoy the superficial aspects of Star Wars, the lightsabers and the Sith and the Jedi and just the conflict of it all, without giving a ton of thought about any of the substance underneath it, what it all means. And in both cases, that is your prerogative. That's perfectly fine. You can like it or not like it for whatever reason you want. But yeah, I do think the people who tend to enjoy The Acolyte see Star Wars as a more gray thing. They don't necessarily have the most favorable opinion of the Jedi. I've seen a lot of Jedi hate, if you will, ever since the prequels, which I think are misunderstood. That's something else I could get into and ramble on about for a while. But anyway, going along with this gray philosophy, one of the reasons why I think people enjoy that, why it has become popular ever since, say, Game of Thrones and other shows as well, don't get me wrong. But I think one of the reasons why Game of Thrones was so enjoyed was because when you do have moral ambiguity, when no characters are necessarily good or evil, there's just infinite shades of gray, it makes things unpredictable, and that unpredictability makes things more interesting, in a manner of speaking, or more, well, unpredictable, obviously, and thus you are always kind of on the edge of your seat. Anything could potentially happen, and that's exciting. And usually, and you could argue this is maybe the flaw of more traditional good versus evil storytelling, is that, well, the good guys usually tend to win in the end. I mean, they almost always win in the end, right? And so it generally comes down to a unique or interesting way to tell the same old story. The hero's journey, it works, obviously, but it has been done many, many times before, and I guess you could say it gets stale. Some people just want to see something different besides, here are the good guys, they're going to beat these bad guys no matter what. They want to know that anything can potentially happen, and I think that is one interesting aspect of The Acolyte from a certain point of view, that the bad guys do win, and that there is some attempted complexity there, that the good guys are not just presented as clean-cut good guys who will ultimately win, and the bad guys are not presented as just malevolent and evil for the sake of being malevolent and evil, there is a reason, and it is because of the good guys in this particular instance that the bad guys are bad. But kind of going along with the other questions you had there, I don't necessarily think that is the purpose of Star Wars. Now, you could argue differently. You could think that it should be more morally ambiguous. I tend to think it was created with the idea to not be something that kind of skews the lines between good and evil. It is meant to inspire us. It is meant to show us examples of goodness and selflessness and sacrifice. That can be a reminder in the real world that if we can be a little bit better, maybe this world can be a little bit better. But yeah, I get why some people like The Acolyte, and I hope they can understand why I don't like it, and I don't think it is good Star Wars, and not just because I don't think it is a very well-written show, but because I think it kind of, again, it kind of skews the line between good and evil. It muddies the water, it tries to gray things up, and I really think Star Wars, more often than not, if pretty much not always, good defeating evil. Alright, let's move on to this one from Hunter Gargoyle, who asked, Hey Thor, I know my introduction to Star Wars was unusual, basically being shown the OT on VHS and simultaneously told by my older cousin, who I consider a father figure, that the Jedi are lame and they would be better suited making a Boba Fett movie in the very edgy 90s teenager fashion. But do you think there are other fans like that who perhaps got burnt out on the Jedi being the main focus and possibly left the fandom? I love the universe of Star Wars, but I always figured there was more to it than Jedi. I guess it's kind of like comic book guys saying, I'm a DC Comics fan, but I don't read Batman or Superman comics because I got tired of the poster boys or similar. And not to contradict myself or my response to the previous question here, where I basically argued that, yeah, Star Wars is kind of the battle of good versus evil at the very core, or the dilemma of being selfless or selfish and personal gain versus a greater good, and all those sorts of things. But I mean, as I always say, you can like Star Wars for whatever reason you want. We all kind of jumped on at different points throughout history here, throughout the last 4.5 decades at this point. Some people grew up with the OT, others the prequels, some people checked out Clone Wars, or maybe they started reading the EU. We all have different reasons why we like it, and we are all going to gravitate towards different aspects of it. But anyway, if you like Star Wars to be a good bounty hunter story, if you like it to be something not Jedi, if you're kind of sick of the Jedi, I think that's fine. I know I said in the video the other day, I think the best way to get Star Wars back on track is to tell a good Jedi story, and I think that's because more often than not, that is what people think of Star Wars as Jedi versus Sith and lightsabers with a good moral foundation. Again, that's not everybody's view, but I think that is the widely accepted view of Star Wars, that it's good guys, bad guys, Jedi, Sith, lightsabers, big space battles, and if you really want to try to fix the problems with the fan base or the franchise itself, if you are Disney and Lucasfilm, and you are looking at the numbers for your franchise and they keep going down, I think trying to get back to basics, getting back to a good Jedi versus Sith story is the way to go. But yeah, absolutely, you can continue to make content that is not that. You can do bounty hunter stories, you can do whatever type of stories you want, you can do more like Skeleton Crew, you can do more like Andor, but I think you always want to kind of fall back upon that Jedi and Sith, because that is just what a lot of people see Star Wars as, and a lot of people love that aspect of Star Wars. A lot of people are more interested in that aspect of it or the philosophy around it than anything else. Okay, and kind of keeping this theme or line of questions, we have this one from Spore Gull Times 2, who asked, Hey Thor, I don't know if this is a common thing, but the reason why Andor didn't feel like Star Wars to some, but to me, despite how much I loved the show, it was the switch in genre. To quote Empire of Dreams, Star Wars was more space fantasy than science fiction. Now, that's not to say that we need our favorite space wizards, as the fantasy genre has a lot more to offer than magic. Other Star Wars projects, like parts of Clone Wars, Bad Batch, and especially The Mandalorian, have that fantasy feel. It's about the environments, different races, and unique cultures, or, for better and for worse, lacks that fantastical feel and just goes for sci-fi. That does help the series in some ways, but I think that's why some people felt like it was set in a generic sci-fi universe. Like I said, I loved Andor, but the only time it was fantastical was when they were escaping from the Imperial base and they see those lights. And yeah, I don't disagree that Andor kind of lacks that fantastical element, and that is definitely one of the reasons why some people will say it is not Star Wars, because it does feel more like science fiction, just kind of pure science fiction, than it does science fantasy or like a giant space opera or whatever else you might want to think of Star Wars as. Because yes, Star Wars does lean heavily into the fantasy side of things. It is not trying to be necessarily technical all the time with what it is doing or presenting. There are things in there that certainly do not align with the laws of physics as we know them. But anyway, yes, Andor lacks some of that fantastical feeling, and I kind of wish it was in there. I mean, I love Andor as is. I don't know that it needs to change anything, but I do think it could have had a few more aliens. It could have had a little bit more Star Wars-y stuff or look and feel to it at times. Again, it's great as is, but I do understand the argument. I do understand why some people really don't like Andor or feel it is not Star Wars. But to me, as someone who I think cares the most about kind of those core themes and messages, and don't get me wrong, I love lightsabers and space battles. I love spectacle too. I think Andor said something that is very on par with what George Lucas has tried to say about Star Wars, that it is about good versus evil. It is about right versus wrong. But what Andor does so well is explore the complexities of that it is not always easy to just be a good guy and to do the right thing, especially when the bad guys are being really bad and doing some really horrible things. How do you stop somebody with absolutely no moralistic integrity whatsoever who will do anything and everything to retain or gain power? But anyway, I'm going to stop my rambling there and say that, yeah, I kind of agree that Andor maybe does feel a little too science fiction and not enough science fantasy, and that maybe if it kind of just embraced a little bit of that more on the periphery, that it had a little more aliens and stuff like that in there, maybe less people would have had an issue with it. I don't know. Like I said, I think it captures the themes of Star Wars near perfectly, but it doesn't necessarily capture the look and feel of Star Wars perfectly. All right, well, I think that is going to be all I got for you this time. I was going to do a few more questions, but I think I rambled long enough on these three. Then again, maybe people want these videos to be longer and me to just ramble about more topics and questions. I don't know. You can tell me that in the comments below. Do you want really long ramble videos, or do you just want short ones here and there? Whatever the case may be, leave those comments below or ask your questions below. By now, most of you know how to do that. You start your comment off with "Hey Thor," you ask your question. I try to respond to it in a future video. But whatever the case may be, leave those comments below. Let's continue to talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.